As I mentioned, we're 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and this is a part of a larger context, a series of questions that the church in Corinth had apparently sent to Paul. We obviously don't have the questions recorded, but we can get a pretty good idea of what the questions were by the way that Paul responds to those questions. But as we saw, the question that is identified here that's really covered in chapters 8, 9, and 10, the question of eating meats offered to idols, Paul's answer makes it clear that that question is a lot more complex, a lot deeper than they realized when they asked it. Because he doesn't give them a yes or no answer. Instead, what he talks to them is how their response, let me see if I say this a better way, that the way they respond is more important than the answer to the question itself. We talked about this contrast. And when I say contrast, I want to be careful. I'm not saying knowledge or love. What is the connector that Paul says we need to have between the words knowledge and love? Love governs knowledge, or knowledge with love, knowledge controlled by love. Knowledge is good, but knowledge without love, without that temper, without that control, Paul says it puffs up. And so then when he says, but love edifies, he's not saying love without knowledge. He's saying knowledge that has love, that is controlled by love. That is what edifies. And so he spends really all of chapter 8 not really answering the question whether they could eat meats offered to idols or not. I mean, he does address that point. He talks about the fact that what is the knowledge that we have? What are the idols? They're non-existent. They're a figment of man's imagination. And so therefore, the meat that has been offered to the idols, what significance does that meat have? Nothing. It's nothing. That's the point he makes. But that's not the answer to the question. The answer to the question is, does your knowledge tempered by your love for your fellow man? And so when we get into chapter 9, we need to realize this is the thought that's continuing on. What Paul is doing is something he does very commonly through all of his writings, is that as he's talking about an issue, he'll kind of stop and focus on one particular part of that issue, and he'll dig deeper into it. And that's what he's doing in chapter 9. He's focusing on one word. I mentioned there's really two things that chapter 8 tells us about knowledge. One is, he says there in verse 1, knowledge puffs up. But there's another thing that knowledge gives us. Do you think when he says, we know that an idol is nothing, and so therefore the meat that somebody says has been offered to an idol, what does Paul say I can do? I'll say again. He has freedom, exactly. He has liberty. It's the word that the New American Standard has. The other translations may use a different word. So knowledge also gives liberty. And that's what Paul is going to spend time on here in chapter 9, is talking about this liberty, or in fact, he's going to say liberties. He's going to talk about a lot of liberties in chapter 9. In fact, the very first question that he asked in verse 1, what is it? Am I free? Do I have freedom? That's kind of an interesting question, because we normally think that politically. Did they have freedom in that day? Not in the sense we think of. You know, they had an emperor who essentially had absolute power, absolute authority. Now, Paul was a Roman citizen. That gave him more rights or more freedoms than most of the Jews would have had. But of course, he's not talking politically here at all. He's asking the question, am I not free? In other words, has God not given me the freedom to do things? And then he's going to go on with a series of, I counted 14 questions in the first 12 verses. And not a single one of those questions did the Corinthians need to answer for Paul. They're all rhetorical questions. Rhetorical questions are questions that you're not really looking for an answer. You're actually using them as a part of your rhetoric. You're using them as a part of your argument. They're questions that Paul knew the answer to, the Corinthians knew the answer to, and Paul knew that the Corinthians knew the answer to. So he's asking these questions essentially to help them guide their thinking, things they already knew, but they weren't applying. Even as they ask this question, is it okay for us to eat meat that's been offered to idols? And so he's just going to use a bunch of questions, but they're all about him. Is he being selfish here? No, what he's doing is he's using himself as an illustration of the point that he wants them to understand of how to use their knowledge with love, how to use their liberty. And before we start looking at those questions, I want to focus just one more thing on this word, liberty. Does anybody remember we talked about this last class or probably the class before that? The word liberty comes from a Greek word. I don't think I've got it up on here. What is the way it's normally translated in the New Testament? Exousia or something like that is the Greek word. I can't pronounce it properly. It's normally translated authority. We often talk about biblical authority. I've got a Bible class series, so I've taught numerous occasions Bible authority. It's the same thing. It's the same thing as liberty. It actually comes from a Greek word, the Greek verb to be. And it's just an extended or expanded form of to be. And it's essentially the right to exist or the right to be able to do something. So when Paul talks about his liberties, he's talking about authority. As I mentioned, I've taught classes on biblical authority. I think they're important. I will tell you the next time I teach that class, I will teach it differently based on the study that I've been doing here in 1 Corinthians. Because the way I taught it before is the kind of the all importance of authority. And what I will be doing the next time I teach that class is I'm going to be kind of ending with this concept of, yes, we have authority, but we need to realize that our authority still must be governed by love. Authority is kind of like knowledge. By itself, without love, that's not what God's looking for. So anyway, Paul is talking here, I have freedom. I have liberty. I have the right to do, I have the biblical authority, even though they wouldn't use that term biblical. I have the biblical authority, I have the God-given authority to be able to do these things. And so each one of these questions, we're not going to, try to dig down and read every particular question and deal with it. We all know the answer to every one of them. The answer to every one of them is yes. Paul is asking every one of these questions. The answer to every one of them is yes. He has the authority to do this. There is one in particular I want to notice. Verse 4. Do we have a right? Do we have the authority to eat and drink? Why would he ask that question? Doesn't that kind of sound a little nonsensical? It's kind of like, do I have the authority to breathe? Why is he asking the question, do I have the authority to eat and drink? Go back to the end of chapter 8. What's the last thing he says in verse 13? He's making a contrast here. Paul does this all the time. Something he's talked about, he's going to reach back and grab it and put it in another context to make his point even deeper.
Because if food causes my brother to fall, I won't eat certain types of food to keep from.
Yeah, ever again. He said, If love tells me I'm going to hurt my brother, we looked at that contrast last week, the one for whom Christ died to cause him to live, and then by my life, I cause him to die. He says, if my eating meat will cause him to die, I will never eat meat again. And yet, what does he now tell us here in chapter 9? I have the right to eat. So he's got the freedom. He's got biblical authority to eat and drink. He's got biblical authority to marry. And yet, what do we know about Paul? He didn't. He talks about the fact he's got biblical authority to be supported in his work there in Corinth. In fact, his wording is one that, quite honestly, a lot of people feel about some preachers. Do I have the right to refrain from working? They don't do any work, they just preach. It's said sometimes. He's talking about the various things that he has the authority, the right to do, asking all of these questions. And notice he even gives biblical basis for some of these things. He talks about the fact that there's written in the old law in verse 9, you shall not muzzle the ox while he is threshing. Here's the only question that isn't answered yes. Is God only concerned about oxen? Well, of course not. God wasn't concerned only about oxen. So Paul is making the point here. There is authority for a lot of these things. I've got freedom. I've got liberty. Of course, you know, as we build through all of this, there's going to be a but at the end of this. And so after Paul has talked about all these things for which he has liberty, what does he say about that liberty? We drop all the way down to verse 15. What's he say about his liberty? Yeah, he chooses not to exercise it. And I want to make that clear. That's not being imposed on him by the Corinthians. In fact, we saw back in chapter 4 where some people were trying to oppose things, and he says, I'm not having that. This is a choice that he is making. Now, why is he making this choice? And that's really the real important part, the meat of understanding this chapter, is to understand why is Paul choosing not to use these liberties, not to exercise these rights that he has. First of all, he emphasizes in the last part of verse 15, I'm not writing these things that it may be done so in my case. So Paul is not saying, I'm trying to get you to change what's been going on. You haven't been giving me a penny or a denarius, and that needs to change. No, that's not what Paul is saying at all. In fact, he is making the point, I don't want that to change. Now, I've got this point here. Was this something unknown to the church in Corinth? What do we find back in verse 12? If others share this right over you, don't we even more so? What does that tell us that had happened in the church at Corinth? That tells us that they had supported some people, some men that were working there. They had provided financial support for those men. We don't know who they are. Paul doesn't mention them by name. He only mentions himself and Barnabas as two that had worked there without support. But it's clear that there's some who did. So this is not something the church in Corinth had never heard of or never thought of doing, didn't realize. That this was something that they were familiar with, that they understood, they had practiced. And Paul says, I even more so. Why would he have that right more so than whoever these unknown brethren are? Exactly. He's the one who planted. It's the word he used back in chapter 3. I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the increase. So if there's anybody who has a right to be supported, it would be the one who had planted there. But again, he emphasizes, I'm not accepting that. I don't want to accept it. I have heard people say about Paul, and I think it's people that have a presupposed idea or really haven't studied, that Paul was actually very arrogant. Now, Paul does often use the word boast. And he's going to do that right here. He says in verse 16, if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of. In what way is Paul using boast here? And I think it really gets to the root of what we talked about, what his illustration here is in chapter 9. He says, I'm not using my liberty. Why is he telling them that? He's not even in Corinth at this point. So why is he talking about what he has done among them? I'll give you a spoiler. Look at chapter 11, verse 1. What does he say there in chapter 11, verse 1? I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Exactly. Exactly. And he's telling them, follow my example. That's what chapter 9 is. He's saying, this is the example that I set among you. And in fact, he'll do that numerous times, both in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. He's going to point out, this is the example that I set for you. That's an important point for anyone who preaches the gospel, is to realize that part of your responsibility is to set that example. And Paul makes that point very clear. So when he talks about boasting, he's not talking about boasting in bringing glory to me. But as Missy's point was, he's bringing glory to Jesus. So his boast is not in what I have done, but in fact, his boast is what God has done with me. His boast is, this is what knowledge tempered with love looks like. This is how someone should use their liberties. Choosing when to exercise them and choosing when not to exercise their liberties. So he says, my boast, please go ahead.
Because he says, if I just preach the gospel, I got to do that, I never to do that. I assume it's a reference to the fact that he has been called by God to do this, so he can't say no. But he wants to do more than is required.
That's a very good point. And in fact, Romans chapter 1 has that same point in verses 14 through 16. It makes a great 3-point sermon. He starts by talking about the fact that he is under compulsion. And then he talks about his privilege, the fact that he has the opportunity to preach the gospel in Rome. He had really wanted to do that. But then he concludes with, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And that's his passion. And you're very right. I think that's the same thing we see here. Paul is talking about the fact that it's important for him to go beyond simply what he's compelled to do. And again, that's a great example for us as children of God. How many times have you heard people say, just tell me what I have to do? And I'll give you the same answer that Paul gave. What you have to do, you're looking for knowledge. And you're missing something. If you're trying to figure out what's the bare minimum that I have to do to be pleasing to God, you're never going to get there. Instead, you have to have the attitude that Mike pointed out here. What can I do for God? What's the most I can do for God? And that involves not only what I'm doing for God, but it's what I'm doing for God's people. And that's ultimately what we see here with Paul. He's saying, I have the right to these things. But what I can do is not exercise those rights. And in doing so, I'm serving you. Now, does that mean it was wrong for any preacher to accept support? No, he's already referenced that in verse 12. And he doesn't say that those men who did accept support were wrong. In fact, he's argued that we have the right to refrain from work, in other words, supporting ourselves. He wouldn't have said that was a right if it was actually wrong. He said this is a liberty that we have, but he had chosen not to exercise that liberty. And obviously that had something to do with the situation in Corinth. Look, if you would, yes, please.
I think a lot of those preachers, just in preaching, even if they're getting paid for it, even just choosing to preach, they're giving up their liberty because they have the liberty to go do something else.
Mhm.
Paul's made it clear that he does not have that liberty. Jesus came to him on the road to Damascus and told him this is what he's going to do. So
Right.
that's liberty Paul doesn't seem to have. But another preacher who maybe gave up some lucrative career in something just to become a poorly paid preacher is giving up his liberty in accepting those, even in accepting those words.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very good point to make. Let me, yes, please.
To me, it's also it's typical of Paul, just he wants to get as much done as he possibly can. And by standing for these things that he has the right to do, it eliminates any doubt that he has an ulterior motive doing it.
Exactly.
Therefore, he doesn't have to deal with the potential talk about any of it. Just abstain from all of it, stays focused, just laser focused.
Exactly. Brett's point illustrates what I want to look at next, the idea that Paul is essentially removing the obstacles to his work in Corinth, because there were people who were critical of Paul, looking for something to criticize about Paul. And if he had accepted financial support from them, they would use that as a tool against Paul. And so he emphasizes the fact that I have not accepted any money from you, and I will not accept any money from you. It's essentially to do that very thing, so that he takes away their ability to criticize. But did Paul accept money from any churches? Look in Philippians chapter 4. There's actually a number of different references, but for sake of time, we'll just look at this one. If somebody could read verses 14 through 18, Philippians chapter 4. (14 through 18).
Yourselves also know that the first preaching of the gospel I traveled to Macedonia. No church here in the matter of giving, receiving for the law. For even the Thessalonians sent a gift for the gospel. Not that I seek the gift itself, but I seek for the profit, which increases to your account. But I have received everything in full and have an abundance. I am amply supplied, having received from Epaphroditus what you have sent. A fragrant aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, will please to God.
I don't want to dig too deep into this, but it's interesting to notice that Paul is telling the church in Corinth, I refuse to accept money from you. And it's for your good that I'm doing that. And he accepts money from Philippi multiple occasions. And he says the same thing. It's for your good that I accept that. that tells us there were some differences between the church of Corinth and the church of Philippi. And again, I don't want to try to dig too deep into what those differences were, but it, again, circumstances tells us that completely different responses had the same motive behind it of love, of doing what's best for them in trying to do that. In Acts chapter 18, we'll not take the time to read it, but when we find the story of the planting of the church at Corinth, that's where we find out that Paul's training was as a tent maker. And he worked with Priscilla and Aquila, making tents until Timothy arrived. And obviously what that meant was Timothy had brought money, probably from Philippi, if not from other places also. And Paul stopped making tents and devoted himself to the word there in Corinth. He also stayed in Corinth for 18 months. Most likely, there was money being brought to Paul more than just once for him to be able to be there for 18 months without receiving any support from the local church. But again, he did all of this because of his care for them. Yes, Michael.
There's a good point that was made how this hands-off criticism, people can't say, you're only good for the money. It's like, what money? But, and that's a good point, but that doesn't seem to be his first reason. I'm sure it's a reason, but his primary reason, the reason he gives right here is he doesn't want them to make his boasting void.
Mhm.
And sort of turn that over in my mind. I don't think I did. You know, and I guess maybe it's kind of like if you like somebody's like organized out of the stop and you help them, you're so grateful, they're going to give you some money. And you're like, no, you're not taking this good deed I just did. What do you mean? Is that what he's going for?
Well, let me add a little bit to that last statement. This good deed I did that glorified God. It's not a good deed. It's not taking from him. He doesn't want to take away from God. That's the point. I agree with what he said, but I want to emphasize the idea. It's not Paul is looking for, look at what I've done, look at the sacrifice I've made. But it's more to set this example before them. And again, there are clearly some differences between Corinth and Philippi. There's an example that he felt like he needed to set before them of not accepting financial support for what he was doing with them. That was a big deal to him.
Says it seems right. The more I think about it, that's sort of like if you do something good for somebody, you don't want to get paid for it. Kind of, it feels, I don't know how to really work it. It kind of feels like it takes it away. You know, if someone comes around and pays you for the nice thing you did, you kind of feel like they've robbed you of something maybe. I mean, I gotta emotionally, I guess I kind of understand it if I think about it, but just the first time you read it, or the first time you read it after a while, you kind of forgot about it, and you're kind of stuck by making that posting void. What are you talking about?
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that boasting was the boasting of how he was demonstrating love for them. And that's the real key to understand. All of this is ultimately saying, I'm doing this for your good. And that was his goal all along. Everything that he did among them was for their good. Anybody else with any thoughts or comments while we're talking about this? It is an important distinction to make, that we understand why Paul has this motive. What was it was so important to him?
Yeah, it is interesting. I think sort of what you're saying is, you don't feel that way. Like if you go above and beyond at work, and then your boss says, you did a great job, here's a bonus. You're not like, oh, but if you do an act of charity and someone does it, you do generally kind of feel like, no, it's not about money. What is money?
Exactly. You just want to do something good. Yes, Chad. Mm-hmm.
I don't know anything that here has I didn't know everything's like black or white. I'm sitting here trying to think of an example of what you can do. I can do.
Mhm.
Well, okay. I
Mhm.
Supposed to do this, supposed to be here at a certain time.
I think that may be a good place to start. When we say supposed to, why are we supposed to? Is there a verse that says you have to assemble on Wednesday night?
Again, what else would we say that it's either way?
Yeah, it's essentially what it's saying is I have the liberty to be here or I have the liberty to stay home. There's not a verse that tells me I have to do that. So what choice, what's my motivation? Why am I going to make the choice I make? And that's the key. If someone says, hey, is there a verse that says I have to be there on Wednesday night? I'm going to tell them, you're asking the wrong question.
One I used to use is I have the liberty to wear shorts to the church, but if I love my brothers and sisters, I know that wearing shorts make them uncomfortable.
Mhm.
The same thing with wearing short skirts, really short skirts.
Mhm.
You know that it's gonna cause others to stumble, it's gonna be an obstacle, but they won't go to focus in church.
Yeah.
Out of love, you should not wear that to church.
Yeah, good question.
I could, with no love, just do what I want to do.
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah, I would say in the sense it's a liberty in the sense that there's not a verse that's going to say that it's sinful. You know, as long as it's modest. And again, what's modest? Modest is a relative term.
Not sin,
Um,
correct, but it's that, I was wrong. Right? Like,
well, right, but you're doing it because your love is telling you to do that. It's not because someone has imposed a rule on you. You've imposed that rule on yourself, which is in fact what Paul is saying here in chapter 9. I have imposed these rules on myself. Nobody else has imposed them on me. I have the liberty, but I choose myself that I'm not going to do this because I know it's good for you, for me not to do that. Does that make sense when we talk about liberty? Mhm.
we're not supposed to drink a lot, but one of them clearly doesn't have a issue with
Mhm.
addiction. Like, I don't, I'm just sitting here saying, the way I am supposed to live,
Mhm.
it's very black and white.
Sure.
I don't know of many things that
Well, I guess that's the point, kind of the point I want to get across here, is that it's not black and white. It shouldn't be black and white. I know I grew up, my parents were members of Church of Christ, had been all my life. And so I heard lessons in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, you know, all the way up. And many of those things were black and white for a long time that I heard. And as I've grown as a Christian, I've come to realize that the black and white is not somebody imposing a rule on me. The black and white is me by my love imposing what I'm going to do, what is best for my brother and sister in Christ. And for God. So when it comes to like Wednesday night, I choose to be here because I think it glorifies God and I think it encourages my brethren to do so. And it certainly helps me also. Mhm.
seriously, I don't think necessarily. And it's like, it's me, but I don't think it's service level. It's out and say, listen, this is what I've decided to do because I'm following God this way.
Mhm.
But you don't have to do this. I presenting.
Well, what I will argue is he's not saying the specifics. You have to make the same choice I do. What I will argue is that he's saying you have to choose to use your love as you're making these decisions. That's what he's saying. You need to follow my example. You need to make all of your decisions tempered by your concern for your brother and sister. That's the way I read it. And that's why I think the fact that he didn't answer this question directly. Can we eat meats offered to idols? He actually will get to that in chapter 10, and we'll talk more about how that relates to what we've been talking about tonight when we get to chapter 10. But what he's really focusing on is the why you make the decision, not what the decision itself is.
Some of these examples seem to sort of say that he, one of his things was right to take life.
Yes.
And it's something given up. I don't think he's trying to get everyone to not take a wife. He's just using it as an example of something he's all right to do, but he is given up.
Well, I will say that he does say that he thinks it's better if they don't, in view of the circumstances they were going through. But he made it very clear, I do not say this by way of command.
You know, even he didn't see this, so I think he's trying to say, see this, I'm better than him because, you know.
Good example. Yeah. Yes, Pat. And I think that's the point that Paul is saying. If you didn't hear, Pat said that, where somebody, kind of going to Mike's example, trying to do something for somebody and they wanted to pay him. And he said, no, please let me do this for God. And I like that. That's the real point that you see with Paul. I'm sorry, we've run out of time. We'll pick up at verse 19 because it still continues this same idea, but he's going to get really into the reason why his particular relationship with Corinth, why he chose not to exercise his liberties. And that's what he's going to focus on in verses 19 through the end of the chapter.